Thank you, everyone. All excellent papers and presentations. Just one quick question to Gongchen, though. Now, I'm not entirely sure, and please do clarify, in terms of just what sources are you using to make sense of how these bureaucrats communicated? Now, did they have the option and opportunity to simply send uncensored mail between themselves? Did they not fear interception? Or did they have other spaces for debate and dialogue amongst them? I mean, how decentralized was this bureaucratic network? Were bureaucrats from all parts of, say, Eastern China brought into this? Was it more of a Beijing thing locally? And again, to what extent then does this not, and I think Sylvia for reminding me of Jody Dean's concept of the public that matters, which is to say it need not be that large of a public to begin with, but it is so long as it is a public in some sense, restricted as it might be, and that's the public that really has a sort of input into the decision-making process ultimately, then maybe that's not necessarily as revolutionary a claim in the end. Yeah.
Oh, right. Thanks for the question. And do you mean like what material I would use for? Like,
yeah.
Yes. I think the main material would be like the correspondence, like the letters between different officials, and it's very understudied because like it's very important in the history of art in Chinese history because their handwriting is more worthy for like doing studies, and the content of the letters is very massive. The quality is massive, and so it will be very difficult to pick up some useful message from them. And handwriting is not very clear as well. So this part of material is very understudied if we want to see their correspondence, like what they are talking to each other and what their discussion about some political events. So I think this would be the material that will helpful. Yeah.
But is this official correspondence or is it private?
It's personal. It's very personal.
Okay,
like between the officials themselves, like friends, maybe in some festival to send letter to each other to show some greetings, and they will have some personal conversations through this kind of letter about the political events. Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very, very interesting. The importance of the cross, this person, James, is the only case, is an isolated case, or there's more than intermediaries?
Okay, I think as far as I know, like in my studies, this is the only case I have looked into very deeply. So there could be some more like other cases, but I don't have didn't pay attention to them at the moment. There could be some possibilities because this is the most famous one. Because
can you speak a little louder?
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
No. Good try. But no, because James Lin, his case is the most famous one. He's the only one who dared to petition the emperor, and so it's a very big event. So there are a lot of records of it. So which means we can see some more details about this case. So I don't know if there are any other cases exist, but I think so. Yeah, it would be my late future direction to doing this research. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you for your I want to just put some food for thought.
Sorry, just a quick question from Mark. I can see the different nature of these failings. I know we've had very limited time to discuss it, but to what extent was the focus on the system, the response to, fears of accusations of libel, accusations of sedition, the very strict legal limits on what you can say? Is that what drove a more systemic discussion? And did that systemic discussion, did it become nuanced? Were there some parts of the system you felt that got more criticism than others? Was it starting to move towards a more granulated institutional model? Sorry, that's two questions, but effectively, first of all, how far was it restricted by, legal limits of what you could say without fear of prosecution? Because I've seen examples of, senior legal figures discussing whether or not to prosecute some of the books you mentioned. And secondly, is there, and not linear, but is there some general trend across the 18th century towards one of those models more strongly than another?
So you're absolutely right that there is a legal framework within which this is all operating, and there are laws about sedition which ironically become stronger after the lapse of the licensing acts which control the press. So that is certainly a factor. In the book that Ricard and others edited recently, I've explored this concept of systems a bit more fully and argued there that it was a way of talking about religion, about astronomy, things not to do with politics initially. And it's really only in the early 18th century that it becomes applied to the political sphere. But then does quite rapidly take off as a way of condemning forms of corruption. So I don't think it's as related to the legal context as perhaps you might think. But I do think that parts of, one of the problems of the system as a language is, are you dealing with the whole system, or are you dealing with subsystems? Essentially, is your problem with the legal system, or the military system, or the fiscal system, which are subsystems within the whole? And at times, they are more interested in those subsystems than they are in the whole system. But I think you can see with Cobbett's condemnation of the thing that he wants to lump the whole lot together and see them as deeply interconnected. But that's quite a difficult thing to explain. One of the beauties of Thelwell's lectures is that he goes through these different subsystems one by one, but then keeps on saying, but you have to see the whole, you have to see how these are interconnected. And he achieved quite interesting audiences. We know that at least 500 people turned out to listen to him, and then he published these lectures. But how much purchase that had on a broader discussion is much harder to define. And so I suspect that for many people, the subsystems are actually more important than the system as a whole.
Yeah, thank you.
So do you have any question related to this? Because Ricard has one question that's related to the Mark 91.
Yes, okay, thank you very much, Joan. So you Mark said that usually institutional and systemic corruption was very abstract and therefore difficult to fight, to identify, and therefore the attacks were directed to individuals rather than institutions or the system. So I was guessing if this is because the fact that institutions and systems tend to protect themselves and to divert attention to individuals which are more easily attackable. Okay, easily.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a lot in that. How far, though, some of these institutions are in a position to deflect is another matter. So, for example, the institution of the electoral system has no real capacity. There's no real sort of central authority that can defend that, because Parliament has a duty to investigate allegations of corruption at elections. Obviously, with things like the legal system or the ecclesiastical, the church system, there are figures there that have a vested interest in defending their turf. So absolutely, there are quite protracted debates and defences of the church or the legal system that are put out into the public discourse. And I suppose that's what's always fascinating to us, isn't it, as people interested in corruption, that you have these really interesting contests between often two different views of the same thing, and you get the condemnation of something which other people can legitimize and defend. And again, that is one of the reasons why the system is so difficult to take on. Because it is also capable of producing really effective counter-propaganda, if we want to use that term. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps we will ask.
Oh, yeah.
Two questions, and one for Elisa, a specific question for your analysis of early Chile. Your governor, as an outsider, and when he arrives, and what did he know? What was his visibility? How did he read things happening in Chile? What was his knowledge? What else could have been done? Could he have done then? Build friendships and build his own network. He, as an outsider, out of the polity, of an early polity which is not yet, let's use the 19th century, it's not yet bureaucratized. It's not like a state-like. So what could he be done then? Build friendship and of course create a rivalry that would then turn against him, to marginalize him, or to... And a question maybe more general that comes from Ricard and David's analysis about the public. In your analysis, your major point is that no scandal occurs if there is mechanisms of accountability or control which are inner, within the, let's say, you can maybe come back to this. So if there's inner mechanisms of control of accountability that bureaucrats or the guilds held accountable, don't need to go out in the public to use the public to make pressure or to... So could you say that in that regard, when scandal happened in Catalonia, in your case studies with those individuals, is that because they were already marginalized, expelled from their corp, their group, their belonging, and then they needed the public, so they created the public? I don't know. The public was then instrumentalized, used, and created. I was wondering what you could say about that.
I will take advantage of having this, because if I don't write it down, I would forget the question in 2 minutes. Yeah, good question. I don't know what to say, actually. Obviously, there were political or corruption scandals when anti-corruption or accountability institutions were running in the 16th and the 17th centuries. Although scandals tended to be far less important and far more strange or not in a regular basis, whereas in the 18th century, when they just killed any type of accountability institutions, what we can see is that scandals start to emerge. And it's fascinating, we have not quoted this particular case, but so the Nueva Planta was introduced in 1716, and in 1722, I think it is, in Girona, which is one of the main cities of Catalonia, there was a public uproar against the city councillors, well, the corregidores and regidores of the city council of Girona, and because of mismanagement of funds, etc., and corrupt practices. And it was fascinating because the public, or the people who were basically trying to attack them, claim something, and I think it's quite literally like this: in the previous system of government, you would not have dared to act in this way because there was accountability and consequences. Now you don't have accountability, you don't have consequences, and you are acting as corrupt people. Because we have to bear in mind that even though the system was completely changed, usually the same people who were ruling city councils and institutions in 1713 were the same ones ruling institutions in 1716. And after the change of government, they started to act like a super corrupt people, and they were the same people. And at the end of the day, this relates a little bit, I think, to the thesis of the Nobel Prizes of this year, which their idea is like something that there are no bad people in management, there are only bad institutions or good institutions. And somehow it's a path to explore because contrary to them, which basically analyze contemporary institutions in a short term, historians, we have the long perspective view, and we could delve more into these questions. I don't know if David wants to add something to that.
Well, I absolutely agree. I mean, there's not this idea of that there's no scandals in the previous system of ruling, but the fear of this continuous prosecution, as Ricard has said, is important. But for the 18th century, which is the one that I know better, the point is that there's also this collision against the public management of things, which is ruled by public order of things, but also managed by military men that follow a different order and a different path of not only the managing of things, but also the accountability of their management. So there's this collision between these, apart from the fact of that there's no accounting mechanisms in place. So I think that the proliferation of such massive number of scandals, it's also this response in which the local authorities or the local populace, depending on each case, exploit the fear of rebellion, of public disturbance, etc., as a way of pressuring the authorities to prompt persecution against these officials and this perceived corruption.
And I want to add something on top of that. You have to imagine, or you have to bear in mind that in 17th century Catalonia there were, like I said before, 4 main anti-corruption institutions, and the most important one, or the one I think is the most important one, at least because of its numbers, was the Visitat General, which was the accountability institution of the regional government, the Generalitat. And you have to bear in mind that in between 1600 and 1714, they issued 3,368 verdicts against unruly officials. So it was a massive amount of anti-corruption procedures against unruly officials. So this is also something that adds up to our argument that, the everydayness of accountability somehow influenced
and also the strength of practices. In the old system, you have centuries of pre-existing action against corruption and practices. Within the new system, the Nueva Planta, until its disappearance in the 19th century, there's like a continuous limbo of what's going on. Where do we have to prosecute this person? In the case of Jerónimo Vago, he could not be persecuted by the Real Audiencia because they had no jurisdiction over him. He had to be prosecuted by the Council of State, and then the Council of State had to delegate the jurisdiction to the Real Audiencia, because during the creation of these offices, these new offices in Catalonia, they did not translate exactly what happened in Castile in Catalonia. They adapted this in this extraordinary measure government that was placed in that moment. So these gray zones in between the offices and how to prosecute this behavior are the ones that led to we think this explosion of
hypothesis.
Hypothesis. Let's keep it that way.
Thank you for the question. We have to think the Spanish Empire is very, very well connected. So there is a enormous circulation of information between Chile, Peru, after Panama, and after that Sevilla. Yes, the governor was an outsider, but he was very, very well informed by this information, this circulation of information, but by the procuradores who were in Spain in general. The information is always related to the economic situation of Chile, because there is this financement of the army was 242,000 ducados. It's a lot for the period. So they very well informed about this financement, but about the slaves too, because in Chile the Indians were slaves, and they sell the Indians to Lima, and they very how can I say?
They were really expensive.
Expensive, yes. Sorry, I was thinking a lot in English. So there is two information: this financement, but the cost of the slaves. So yes.
Thank you very much. And yes, thank you so much for your magnificent presentations, contributions, all of you. I am concerned a little bit about two concepts. On the one hand, about the concept of abuse of power, and the second one about collective action. My questions are for you, all of you. It's a transversal question. Related to the first one, abuse of power, Elisa, you have said that in the Spanish Empire it was a concept, polysemic concept. I would like to know if this concept is exactly appropriate for the other context. The other context you deal with. And the second one, collective action, is a concept used in your contribution and the read, and I would like to know as well if it's appropriate for the other context. And if it's possible, you give some words more about this, the use of this concept in 18th century Catalonia. Thank you.
Do you want to answer, or I?
You have the microphone.
I have.
Use your power.
I have. Well, yeah. When we refer to collective action, we, at least in the contribution, we focus on this only source or only space of mobilization that is allowed within the frame of the Nueva Planta, which is the organization through the guilds in as the only representative instance that the townsfolk has in this municipal system after 1714, 1716 and 18, in which the records of, judiciary records are, a difficult source because sometimes they are really biased in what and towards what the process wants to focus. But reading several of these processes and how the court acts and testimonies, etc., what we can see is that there's a broader sense of the common folk getting towards these institutions that have survived and are, in some cases, representatives of the general interest of the town. of course, this concept is not used at the time, but I mean, they imbued themselves, at least using the perceived authority that the delegation through the guild gives them to represent against the perceived transgressions of the officials. Sometimes those are the guilds, and sometimes are the same officials that go against other officials using these same arguments. So it's difficult to assess to what extent this representation means to in each context. So it's difficult. But the point is that this collective action, as we have said, not only takes this form of the guilds taking the lead in the prosecution, but also connects, or deeply connects, with these acts of public outrage against the activities. So we cannot understand one without the other. It's important for the same process to have those lampoons, to have this danger of getting things out of hand, to then proceed against the officials because of the dangers posed by keeping them in office. So there's this dual nature of the collective action that is. I don't know if in the other context, yeah.
Sorry, I'd like to add that we can think on one collectivity. There is related to your answer. For me, there is two or more collectivity. So that is why public space is not working in this case, but there is two collectivities in Chile, or 3 or 4, or the ecclesiastical collectivity, and one faction collectivity, another faction collectivity. So there is always a confrontation, and it's very useful. Manage this idea of confrontation for me.
Yeah.
This idea of collectivity or collective action, I think that also, if I understood it correctly, Gongchen is using as a synonym for the public, pre-modern times, or other societies that might have had another political organization. It really reminds me about there is a late medieval historian in the Complutense University of Madrid, in my ring a bell to the ones who have been working on corruption. She's called María Ángeles Martín Romero, and she has been proposing quite lately the idea of using, instead of using corruption as a trademark for studying corrupt practices in the world, perhaps it would be better to use accountability and the very idea of making public officials being accountable to the community. So perhaps we could use also this idea of collectivity instead of the public, because as we already know it, I think I'm not discovering anything to the fellow modernists that are the majority here. The very idea of the public sphere, if you again use the engram viewer and you look at books published, I would even say that the idea of public versus private sphere is something that academia invented in the 20th century, actually. Obviously, if you play with different languages, if you use German, perhaps the Germans were the first ones who really were interested in the 19th century. But if you use the concepts, for instance, in the Spanish language, it's literally the public versus private sphere is something that was invented by academia almost. Okay, so obviously, this is a quantitative data that has to be cross-referenced with documentation in the archives, and these statements have to be somehow a little bit easier to say. They are not truths, universal truths, and has to be explored more deeply. But at the end of the day, these are questions that we as historians have to think about, because sometimes we just use concepts that are useful for our daily basis to communicate with our contemporaries, but in the past were not useful, and we have to bear in mind that always.
Okay, for me, in the 18th century China context, I would say that collective action is a very, nobody used this term or this concept to think about this time period, and as well as the public and private, these two two concepts is very rare as well. So my study and my case study is very beginning of trying to apply this concept into the 18th century Chinese context. So I'm still figuring out what the collective would be and what the collective action would be. It did exist this kind of space or action behind some very important policies and change, as I said before, because the historiography now are trying to attribute a very important policy or change to only one person, the empire himself, or some very few important officials. But the collective action behind it is still understudied. So I think I'm still working on it. So I'm trying to figure out how to apply this concept to fit into Chinese context. It's still understudied and a lot of work to do in that context.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much for the question. So on abuse of power, I think that's an interesting one, because quite often, as actually we've heard from my fellow panelists, accusations can be made against an office holder for abusing their power, which may not actually be what we call corruption. In the book that I published on trust and distrust, one way I sought to explore this was through the legal concept of trust. So in the British context, contemporaries talked about breach of trust or abuse of trust. And by trust, they meant a fiduciary legal obligation to perform their duty in an accountable manner, which legally required them to set aside their self-interest, which legally required them to produce accounts, financial accounts of money passing through their hands, which legally obliged them to have a duty of care. So in the British context, and I'm aware that this is not the case across Europe as a whole, but in the British context, this legal fiduciary notion of a trust and therefore a trustee is something that gives a legal redress, but it also gives a rhetorical form of redress. So you can accuse someone of breaching their trust, and they do repeatedly without necessarily going to law over it. So it's a discursive way of holding people to account that also supplements the legal route. But that trust law sort of goes back to Roman law, and not all European countries have that tradition. And so I think, one thing I would really like to see is a more comparative legal framework across Europe and its empires about how these different legal frameworks are actually shaping not only the notions of corruption but also people's responses to them. I mean, we've heard about the importance of that in the context in Barcelona, and I think that extending that approach more generally to thinking about how do these different legal traditions shape this idea of abuse of trust would be really interesting. On the collective action, so again in the British context, so I think there are two meanings of collective action. So a political scientist's understanding of collective action would be slightly different to the one that we've been talking about. So they talk about collective action problems as how does an individual escape the customs and practices which are all around them, which may be corrupt. So for example, I have a case in the 1770s in Jamaica where an individual is accused of trying to buy an office in Jamaica, and he says, well, everybody's doing this. It can't operate any other way. My hands are tied by the customs and practices of the society in which I find myself, and therefore you can't really blame me. And so I think that's an interesting, different type of collective action problem. But in the way that we've been talking about it today, in terms of popular pressure, I suppose, is another way of talking about this. In the British context, I showed you the crowd that had gathered around Atkinson. There's a crowd that actually literally tears apart the governor on Antigua in 1710. Crowds were enormously important in the passage of the Great Reform Act, the act that reformed the electoral system in 1832. So direct popular crowds on the streets are really important. But in Britain there are also these other mechanisms as well. So the press, the popular access to the press is really important, and you can see in newspapers, you have the people writing into the newspapers to condemn other people and to expose the corruption of other people. But also there's this very strong tradition of petitioning. Petitioning as an informal restraint on abuse of power, I think, is a really important tool. In the Barcelona context, it's a more formal framework with the visitor in up until the early 18th century. In Britain, it may be that is not so much an important framework, but actually the petitioning that is legitimized by the state as a way of redressing grievances is I think, really important.
One question to Ricard and David. This is the question. Spain administration, 18th century, the main public officer, in my point of view, was General Capitan General. Then is a military person. The question is, the prosecution was conducted by military or civilian jurisdiction. The idea is because it's important because liberal state had many problems after to separate both administration in this case. To prosecution corruption are united in the 20th century. Then the question is, at 18th century, what jurisdiction is investigated that?
Ricard, you or?
He asked about 18th century.
Okay, so I go. Well, that's one of the key points in this. I mean, the idea is that the administration in Catalonia during the Nueva Planta, not only in Catalonia, also in Valencia, in Aragon, in Mallorca, the administration was a weird mixture of civil servants, military officers turned civil servants, but also lots of individual people that had or had the power of getting into military jurisdiction, which is foro militar. Let's say it that way. So the point is that these gray zone that I said earlier, in which sometimes until the specific problem does not present onto the authorities, there's no clarification in which how to prosecute someone or how to act against some specific case. So, for example, the Capitán General could only be prosecuted by the Consejo de Estado. And he had to be prosecuted that way. The same happened with the military officers, like corregidores. But the councillors could be prosecuted either by the local tribunals presided by the corregidor, also the Real Audiencia, and also the Consejo de Estado, or Consejo de Castilla sometimes. So it's difficult to know, and then you have the ecclesiastical jurisdiction, which is also really, really important, because lots of those officers that were prosecuted by and accused of corruption, they went to Sagrado and entered the church and could not be held until the religious authorities authorized the either military or the civilian officers to enter and prosecute him, getting him to the royal prisons. So I think that this is you have struck the right chord in the question, because it's really, really difficult to know. But even, or at least my perception after reading quite a lot of documents in 18th century administration in Catalonia, is that the very same officials didn't know how to act. So sometimes they refer to their immediate superior authority to ask in how they could act. For example, in the case that we have explained of Jerónimo Vago, it was the Real Audiencia that asked to the Consejo de Estado if they could prosecute him. Then the Consejo de Estado delegated the capacity of prosecution. But then the Real Audiencia could not execute the sentence because it was a death penalty. And death penalty had to be then passed to the Consejo de Estado to be executed or not. But as this was a really strange and particular case, none of the integrants in that, apart from several oidores from the Real Audiencia that were doctors in law and had more or less how to act in it, knew how to solve the problem. And most of the times, they resorted to the old laws. They went to the Constitucions de Catalunya and prosecuted the officials using the old Constitucions de Catalunya, because the new framework could not answer to the problems faced by this corruption. So, for example, in the case of Jerónimo Vago, in the sentence, you say that in the old laws of Catalonia, this is sentenced to death. Because the legal framework created by the new Bourbon monarchy after 1714 was really general in its...
I would say it was a mess.
Well, it was a mess, but it was really general. I mean, the Decreto de Nueva Planta has only 6 articles. And this was the key document that vertebrated all the administration, not only in Catalonia, but also in the other regions of the old Crown of Aragon. So, yeah, it's a mess. It's a mess for them, and it's a mess for us. And we're trying to figure out how did this work, and this simple question of how did this work is so difficult to know.
So, just to add a little bit on that, regarding the 16th and the 17th century and 15, 14, and so on, the legal system that was acting in Catalonia before the Nueva Planta was clearly and well developed throughout centuries, since the Middle Ages. So in this regard, even though there were officers who were military, like the Brugués, which were the equivalent to the corregidores, there was a system to prosecute them for corruption called the table trial. And this was actually the first accountability mechanism that was issued in Catalonia back in 1283. And it was a system that it was reformed throughout all the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. So they changed the law according to the times in order to adapt to changes of society, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so this is quite the difference between the two systems, and I think that the Nouvelle Plante is a magnific example of less is less. So you destroy the complete system and you get nothing in return because of not thinking about the consequences of implementing. And I would underscore that only a part of the Castilian laws to Catalonia, because if they had implemented the complete Castilian laws to Catalonia, probably it would have been better, because in Castile there were many different accountability procedures. There were with Presidenta, which is the most well known. There were visitas generales, and there were also pesquisas. There were also inventarios de bienes, like literally the most prominent ministers in the monarchy of Spain during the 17th century, they had to present their goods before entering to office in order to check if they were enriching themselves more than what was deemed morally acceptable by the fellow inhabitants. So yeah, this is the main problem regarding administration in Catalonia.
And different tribunals, for example, military contractors, which I know from my PhD, had a tribunal of their own, which was the Tribunal de la Intendencia, and they were prosecuted in this separate tribunal and were judged by the Intendente, which was the same person that had allowed them to get a contract from the state. So it worked, yeah. It was, the key is what Ricard has said. It was an implementation of a part of a system using all the pre-existing legislation that was not directly banned by the Decreto de Nueva Planta, and this created this huge mess of different jurisdictions, different administrations, that on top of that you have the militarization of the higher straits of the administration, in which you have to add this mess of the Foro Militar, which was also working on its own basis that it's really difficult to describe, because they were completely different than other jurisdictions.
Small question about this really complex system that we're explaining, which sounds extremely interesting for me. We're talking about these gray zones and decisions that come after the establishment or the establishment of the case concerning where to or who has the jurisdiction over this case. So I was wondering, in this decision process, do the two sides, the accused and the accusing side, did they have any place in negotiating or suggesting where the case should be taken? Because obviously that would affect the result of the case.
For my experience in cases, both penal, civil, economical, let's say economical or business-related cases, and also religious prosecution and etc. What I have seen is that most of the times, both accusee and accused search for the most reachable and favorable of the instances. And once that instance has answered positively or negatively to their aspirations, they risk another one in which they can exploit their in their benefit. I mean, for example, there's a case in which two religious communities in the same city, in Manresa, had a clash, legal clash to distribute which of the communities had access to a piece of land. This case was started in the court of the corregidor. Then one of the sides, the loser one in the case, escalated that to the Real Audiencia. The same happened to the Consejo de Castilla. And once that was at Consejo de Castilla, they reached to the Tribunal de la Rota, the religious one. So they exploited these gray zones. Usually, or at least what my experience tells is that there's no agreement in which instance do we go together, but let's search which one is has more benefits for our case, so let's point it that way, and if we're not successful, let's search for another one. Usually it happens this way, at least for what I have seen in these several cases. The same happened with the Tribunal de la Intendencia. Once a contractor is found guilty of something at Tribunal de la Intendencia, he escalates that to Real Audiencia or then to the Consejo de Guerra, which is the instance.
Can I just add something? So this problem of multiple jurisdictions, I think is really interesting. Thank you. And it comes up certainly in the British colonial context a lot. So if, for example, in the West Indies you have a grievance, you could take that to the local court on the colony, but you could also appeal to London, particularly from the late 17th century when a Council of Trade is set up. London becomes another possible umpire. And indeed, you could also take a case in the British courts. So Lauren Benton, I think, has written quite interestingly about these problems of multiple legal overlapping jurisdictions. I mean, again, in the Indian context, there's until the British establish a more uniform legal system in India, there is a lot of potential for confusion about which court you actually take a grievance to and how it's resolved. So I don't know if this is the same in the Chilean context with the Spanish Empire as well, but certainly in the British context, this problem of overlapping multiple jurisdictions is a really interesting one.
No, they use all the jurisdictions, but for me it's not a mess.
It's not
Only a cohabitation between different forms or ways the legal courts. It's not because the persons know how and where tribunal have to use for this purpose.
Yeah.
So for me, it's not a really a mess. It's a system. Yes.
They were aware of which was the tribunal or the institution that served their purposes the most. They were perfectly aware of that. And then when they wanted a certain ruling regarding a case that was dubious in between jurisdictions, they always chose the one that it was more interesting for them. And they played within the system. Like, for instance, I was 2 weeks ago I was explaining a particular case that happened in now it's the south of France, but it used to be the north of Catalonia in Vilafranca Conflent, and there was a particular corruption case regarding a fraud involving a flock of sheep in between the frontier between Catalonia and France. And once the authorities of the Generalitat catch the guy like trading without paying taxes, he asked legal counsel of an attorney of Perpignan, and basically the attorney of Perpignan told him like, just bribe the authorities and you will be perfectly fine. But the problem was, like, the authorities already recorded the fraud in the registers. So at the end of the day, they started to try to fabricate a complete case accusing another person of owning the ships. But after that, the visitadores came and said, okay, this case is rather strange, and started investigating everything. And obviously, at the end of the day, they were the officers of the Generalitat who accepted bribes were prosecuted, but not the guy who started the whole mess, which was a private person who actually used the system in his behalf, not in behalf of the authorities, obviously. And this was quite common. And also, you can, I would say that here usually we don't early modernists in Catalonia, we don't pay that much of attention regarding religious institutions, which were very important, were crucial, and they have massive archives.
Yeah.
You know, most of them perfectly preserved. Like, for instance, there is a particular archive in the central of Catalonia, in the city of Vic, and they have a particular court called, how is it called? The Court of Tribunal. Anyhow, a particular judicial ecclesiastical court. No, not that one. Basically, they have judicial cases ranging for all the jurisdictions, not only the ecclesiastical one, ranging from the 13th century until the arrival and imposal of the liberal state. It's fascinating because you go into the documentation and you find cases of any jurisdictions that were acting in a given age. Not only the jurisdiction, ecclesiastical jurisdiction, but also the jurisdiction of the Generalitat, the jurisdiction of the king, because sometimes individuals try to plead before that court instead of the one that they realize that the outcome of the claims would not be as good as the ecclesiastical one. But obviously, somebody has to research that in order to go deeper on the documentation. And yeah, I think it's not that appealing to just immerse in an institution that nobody has worked on. You don't have literature, you don't know how to proceed, you don't know how to analyze the documentation, and so on. So it adds to the problem, and it's very difficult to just pick up a PhD student and say to him, just go there and just spend 4 years looking at the documentation and see what emerges from that mess. Yeah, I think it's not fair.
How open would those archives be? Would they be happy?
They are. On top of that, you go there, you meet the archivist. The first day, the archivist is like some distant guy from you. But after 2 days, he's the best person in the world. To the point that he says to you, just go to the shelves and pick up whatever you want. So basically, it's a dream come true as and it opens on Saturdays, and you can make photographs. And
but it's really nice.
But the problem is like how you organize the mess they have, because they don't know even what's inside that. You know, it's you alone in front of the documentation. Yeah? It's fascinating. And obviously, you have to know Catalan.
And Latin.
Which is also a problem these days.
I'm not trying to frame what I'm going to say after lunch, but approaching the Church of England archives in Lambeth Palace and the Durham Diocesan archives, I was asked questions about what exactly I was researching. So lots of phrases about administrative probity and general answers were given. As I say, I'm quite happy to present my findings in Catalonia, a long way away from where the Church of England might be listening to what I've actually found. Because they genuinely wanted me to they didn't ask me to sign a disclaimer, but they were asking me questions about exactly what, in terms of reputation, I might be finding, because they were very sensitive about this. It is very noticeable that the Church of England is far more sensitive about this, particularly, of course, given current circumstances. And I wonder whether or not,
No, they're super nice, and on top of that, they hold documentation from other institutions, which is fantastic to know, because sometimes in other places they don't.
Not all the religious archives in Catalonia are like the one in Vic.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. But it's the first step. And you need I guess 20 lives to go into the documentation only of that archive, so it's the first step, and you can wait until the other ones evolve.
No, but that one is one of the best that you can work on. But for example, I've worked about the Society of Jesus, and they have their own private archives, so the entrance on that is far more difficult than this one, in which the bishopry is really open to but to show these documents and these records. But for example, the chapel in Barcelona, in Barcelona's cathedral, that one, for example, it's really, it depends on the day. It depends on the it depends on the weather. No, but for example, they have an amazing record of marriage certificates ranging from the medieval era until now. But and they have all of this digitalized, but you cannot access it.
Well, because it was financed by an ERC project. The European Union spent millions of euros. They digitized everything. They created a database, but somehow in the agreement they settled the Archbishopry of Barcelona.
The Archbishopry.
Okay, people who want to check the documentation or the data have to come to our place to check that. But the PC, the PC that holds all the documentation is in the building next to us.
Oh.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Jurisdictional from the 21st century.
It kind of likes political archives as well. When I was, I mean, this is 15 years ago, but when I wanted to look at some papers of the little unionist party, that eventually formed with the Conservative Party in Scotland, I turned up to National, having gone to Scotland, I didn't live there at the time, gone to Scotland specially, and walked into the National Library of Scotland and was told I needed written permission from the Secretary of the Scottish Conservative Party to access that material. You know, and so I had to go down Princes Street and knock on their door. They were more than happy to give it to me, but it was astonishing. They just wouldn't let me access the political archive until I had written permission from the owners of it. And that's still wicked. That's a national archive as well. So, you know, I think we have to be careful of, you know, perhaps we're being a bit optimistic about how transparent these records actually are. And with reputations, particularly of churches, being increasingly questioned in many countries, perhaps they'll be less willing to allow people access. Perhaps we'll need to write, you know, non-disclosure forms before we're actually allowed in. You know, they have to give us permission to publish before we actually see this. Perhaps I'm being negative.
So, well, I have to announce you a cliffhanger. We are going to lunch now, and then we can repeat with this nice experience with another panel. So, if you have some other questions related to sources or the challenge to the modernization theory, or about the multi-sectoral authorities and the problems that derives from it, you can eat if you are starving, and then refresh your and come back again.
One question again. So we can leave everything here safely because we are all locking the door.
Yeah.